Okay, where was I? Our mission is to create opportunities for anyone to learn and share knowledge about the field of user experience. This is a great place to talk with other people about UX. So thank you for being a part of that. It wouldn't be what it is without you being here tonight, and we appreciate you being a part of it. Co-organizers, a lot of people help to make sure that this boat keeps rolling. We are going on 10 years this year. This October, we'll be celebrating 10 years. It can be hard to stay motivated over 10 years. So I appreciate every single person on this screen and everybody who's helped volunteer, everybody who's spoken for being a part of making that continue. All right, DUX planning team for this event. Thank you for helping, especially for Antoine, for writing one of the scripts that we're going to be using tonight. Thanks so much. And yeah, for folks that are joining remotely, it looks like we've got enough folks to do one breakout room and the remote usability testing. So thanks for being on, and try to be on camera and engaged in all that good stuff. Okay, let's get into it. Sorry, that echo thing like threw me off. I need to like reset. All right, here we are. Hey, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Matt. I think you all know me. Does anybody not know me? Have I not talked with anybody that's here?
First times.
Yeah, but I think I've talked with every person here, right? Yeah. All right, cool. Okay. So I facilitated a usability session before. Who else here has? Awesome. Let's flip that around. Who's never facilitated a usability session before? Live in person, not remote, unmoderated, live in person usability test. Never done it. There's not as many people as didn't raise their hand for the flip side. That's okay. We're all going to do it today. So that's exciting. I'm really excited to do that. So let's talk a little bit first about why. So why do we do design research in general? It's so that we can make sure we're building the right thing, right? We want to build the right thing. We want to make sure we understand it well. And from my experience, when you do usability testing, your users will always surprise you. So through user research and usability testing, try to put that in the corner. How do I make this little bar go away? It doesn't matter. It says to understand user friction, product value, and interest. So a lot of times you've used applications and been frustrated by them. It's probably part of your story of why you got interested in user experience to begin with. We build and design things all the time, and we know how they work. So at the other end of our designs, there are users who are being frustrated by them. The things that we design, imagine that. So through user testing, we can identify things like friction points. We can also identify and understand if something that we're building is actually valuable or interesting to our users. Yeah, I think I kind of said this, but like, do our users even want the feature that we're building? It is something that is very interesting to learn when your company tells you, hey, build this feature, and you do some user research and you find out that your users might not want that feature. So here's a little comic about that. I don't know if you can read it. Okay, let's talk about what makes usability testing effective. Does anybody not know what I mean when I say usability testing? All right, we're going to get into that in a minute, but I just wanted to make sure I was kind of giving all the context. So the thing that makes usability testing effective is cognitive science. So if you think about when you put together a puzzle, I think this is one of my favorite examples. So you get a 500-piece puzzle, you dump it out on your table, you start putting it together, and then the day after somebody says, hey, how did you know how to put together that puzzle? Like, what were you thinking with every piece that you placed as that puzzle went together? And you're probably thinking like, well, I don't know, I looked for the edges and then I looked for this color or that color, you know, color blocks in general. But if while you're putting together that puzzle, you're in that moment, in that situation, you can actually be thinking out loud and telling somebody who's researching puzzles, oh, like right now I see this little dot here and it looks like the edge of a flower petal. And that means I'm going to look for the rest of that flower petal over here. Like there's a lot more nuance that you can get when you're in a moment. And kind of going through a task. So yeah, Jacob Nielsen, one of the big ones in the UX worlds, is quoted as saying, thinking aloud, as in thinking aloud during a usability test, may be the single most valuable usability engineering method. So that's cool. One of the other things that I think is helpful and interesting to think about is usability testing is typically evaluative, right? Like you build a prototype, you do a usability test, you see what's wrong with the prototype, you iterate, etc., ship it into production. But you can also have some generative stuff come out of usability testing. So like user research, we typically group as, is it evaluative or is it generative? Like, is it to come up with new ideas or is it to determine if our ideas are good? So you can do a usability test on a product that exists today that might enlighten you about some friction points or some product opportunities that you might not have been aware of before. So it's a interesting opportunity. But yeah, again, typically evaluative as a method. So how do we run a usability test? So a lot goes into running a usability test. A lot of planning and strategy, thinking about how often, how frequently, when in your life cycle you will be testing. Recruiting participants is one of the hardest things to do in user research of any kind, and usability testing is no exception. Thinking about how are you motivating your participants, how you're reaching them, how are you soliciting to them, all that kind of stuff. Then you've got to plan your session, write your scenario, your tasks. You've got to build a prototype probably if it's a new feature. Then you conduct your session, right? That's what we're going to be doing today, is a very focused slice of this story. After the session, you've got to synthesize the results. Okay, well, what did we learn? What are we going to change? Are we going to tweak the prototype? Are we going to keep doing research? What do we need to learn still? What assumptions do we still need to validate? What assumptions did we validate? All of that kind of stuff. And then finally, take action on insights. Figure out what you're prioritizing, figure out what you're building, figure out what you're shipping to production. So again, as I mentioned, we're just focusing on the conducting the session part today. So Antoine and I have written some usability testing scripts that we're going to be using. We're going to be breaking out into some groups and we're going to actually run some sessions together. But there's kind of a split out conducting the session here into first part is going to be your intro. So whenever we hand out these scripts, you'll see it's going to be split up like this. So you'll have your intro, you're going to set your tone and expectations, set the rules for the usability session. Next will be your scenario. So paint a story to that user about the scenario that they would find themselves in ahead of the tasks you're going to give them. Then you're going to give the user some tasks. So make sure you're seeking understanding as they go through those tasks, make sure you're following the rules. And then typically you'd wrap up the session with a little bit more just research, like interview type research, any kind of questions that they have for you. I also like to wrap up sessions sometimes, especially when I'm doing more generative research, with the magic wand questions. So like, say you can you could wave magic wand and change anything about what we're researching today. What might that be? I always think that's a fun question to wrap a session up on. Okay. Any questions so far about the breakdown, the anatomy of usability test, everything that went into this moment? Yeah. Yeah, so user research methods in general can be bracketed typically into one of two categories: generative research or evaluative research. So a user interview is probably going to fall more into a generative method. So like, let's say you're looking for market interest in a particular product space and you're going to do some research with a user, or you're going to do maybe like a contextual inquiry. You're going to go sit with somebody in their office while they try to complete a task. That's going to help generate ideas for you of how you might be able to streamline, evolve, or solve that task with a product. Evaluative research is going to be when you're on the, okay, we've thought of ideas of how to solve that problem. Let's validate that those ideas are right. So you're kind of going broad with generative, like let's get a bunch of ideas. And then you're narrowing those ideas down with evaluative, like, is what we designed actually the right thing? And as we get closer and closer to deciding, yes, this is it, that's, when you're building and shipping your product. Did that answer your question? Cool. There's another question. Usability testing is a specific method where typically you're testing with either a live site or a prototype, right? It can be an application, it can be a website. I mean, it could be actually a physical thing too, right? You could be, doing a usability test on a physical product if you wanted to. Uh, where was I going with that? Lost my train of thought. What is the question I'm answering? User testing is a platform website, I believe, usertesting.com, that runs unmoderated usability tests. So like that phrase, I think usability testing is like the research method I would use. User testing is a brand, as far as I'm aware. Does anybody know anything beyond that? Yeah.
Also, recruitment as well, like we usually say that user testing in line with recruitment, so if you hire like an external recruiter, they might use the term, I find recruiters use the term user testing, more than usability.
Yeah. It might be a little interchangeable. But yeah, like a usability test is the term I would use. What term would you use, Christian? Arose by any other name. Is that what? That's when you have a facilitator. So we're going to be doing moderated usability testing today. So we'll be taking turns as facilitators, participants, and note takers. Unmoderated user research is a whole nother topic that we've talked about before, but typically it involves pre-planning your tasks and your script and setting it up with some tool, like I think usertesting.com is one of them. And then that is going to, run your test asynchronously with a bunch of folks, and then you'll get back recordings of those tests. So you don't have that opportunity to dig in, ask follow-up questions, but it can be a lot easier of a lift as far as kind of sending it off and then getting results back. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Cool. Okay. So let's talk about rules for moderating your usability test. First up, don't lead. So what I mean by that is if your task is for a user to run a report, don't ask the user to run a report. Instead, give them a task where say like, you need to get some information about, such and such thing that's available in this system, and how would you go about doing that? And ideally, they would go over to the button that says run a report, or maybe they're going to say like, oh, well, I need to do that. Maybe I'm going to go to search, or maybe I'm going to go to something else. And you can learn from that as well. But typically you try to avoid using the exact language that's in your user interface, because you don't want to just give them the like thing to go for. Second is let your user struggle. So I've sat for like very uncomfortable minutes before while a user has been actually trying to run a report, and there was a button on the page that said report, and they were like, I wish there was a button that said run a report, and like the button was there and they just did, glossed over it. But that was a really important finding, and it was actually very interesting to have them continue to think out loud and talk through what they were looking for, where they were expecting to see a button, and they were pointing on the screen where they were expecting to see it, and it wasn't where that button was, right? So like them struggling is very helpful with learning about their expectations. Rule number 3, we kind of mentioned answer questions with questions. Actually, maybe we were talking about that before the time. But yeah, so whenever a user asks you a question of like, well, how would this behave? Like, okay, like maybe they're like, didn't get a task completed and they want to ask a follow-up. Instead, ask them, how would you expect it to behave? Or how do you wish it behaved? How would you hope it behaved? Because then rather than just giving them some information about the thing that you're designing, this information that's already in your head, you're gaining new information about what their expectations are. It's all going back. All of this research is about trying to figure out, how can I make this user interface be exactly the expectations of this person? I mean, not this person, but like this person as, exemplar user of the people that are going to be using your system. And by learning what they would expect, you're gaining a lot of insight into, how you can design that interface. Ooh, I'm going long on time. 4, seek a deep understanding and validate your assumptions. So throughout your design process, a big recommendation I have to you is to document your assumptions. When you're doing usability testing, make sure that you're actually crafting tasks and writing scenarios that will help validate your assumptions, either to be true or false. Because once you validate your assumptions, you can then stop treating them as assumptions. But until then, you should really be calling them out and making sure that you're documenting your assumptions. Don't focus on note taking when you're facilitating. And even as a note taker, don't focus on transcribing. I really recommend recording a session so that you have that to go back to for quotes and things, but focus more on the top insights and interesting things. And then finally, check your emotions at the door. We were talking about this before the meetup today, but like, this is something that becomes a lot easier when you stop taking things so personally, which I think is something that we all do as we mature as designers. But yeah, that's an important thing. And there's me moderating a usability test, very frustrated with the user who is not clicking the button their mouse is pointed on top of. Real situation. Okay, who's in the session? So today we're going to have the subject, facilitator, and note taker. You could also have observers. Typically, I like to put them in a different room or kind of get them out of the way so that the subject doesn't, think about all the eyes that are on them. So try to minimize observers as much as possible. And then a few notes on notes. Try to take as quick notes as possible. You can do an empathy map. Say, think, feel, do, and have a quadrant. You can do it more linearly. I really like the I wish, what if style note taking, where you're trying to capture like if the user is pointing at something that they like, right? IL and then whatever it was. Put it smiley faces, emojis, things like that can help kind of capture a user emotion that you're noticing in a particular moment. But at the end of the session as the note taker, ideally you should have a short list of the top insights that you captured in that session to be able to share back with the facilitator and any other observers. And then for capturing insights, really look for the duplicates, look for the insights that more than one person had, like as the facilitator. Yes. Oh, sure. I wish, what if. Yeah, and that's from Sanford D School. I think that's like a method that they frame design feedback, but I think it's really helpful for note taking and user research as well. What's that? Your note taker. Yep. So for these sessions, we'll have subject, the person who's participating, your facilitator, the person who's moderating the usability test, and a note taker. We're going to break into groups of 3. So those are the 3 roles we'll have. The 3 roles we'll have today. Okay. Yeah. So if you can't decide, like if you've just got a ton of notes, just try to find a top 3 to share back out with the group. As you go around, just have every person share what were your top 3 insights from that session. You can gain a lot out of that. Look for duplicates. If more than one person noticed the same thing, ask them to repeat other people, because that helps to like bring those items to the top. Post-its can be helpful for synthesis. You can, and I've done this before, review your findings with the participant after the session to see if what you got is in line with what they meant. Sometimes you're not sure what they really meant in a moment. And then the recordings are really helpful to be able to go back to. And that, I think, is the end of my little slide deck here. So I'm going to talk through what we're about to do, and then I'll take some questions as we get set up. So we're going to break into groups of 3. So feel free to get up on your feet and move around so that you can spread out a little bit and people aren't kind of talking in each other's ears. That might just happen here. But yeah, we'll break up into groups of 3. And then as groups, we're going to run some usability sessions. So I've got 3 scripts for each group. So we'll rotate, pick one person to be moderator, one person to be the subject who's doing the session, and one person to be a note taker. And we'll do a 15-minute usability test, and then a 5-minute debrief amongst your small group at the end of that. You'll rotate roles, do another 15-minute usability test, and then a 5-minute debrief at the end. Rotate roles, and then finally a final 15-minute usability session, 5-minute debrief, and then we'll come all back together and share our top insights. So it's been a minute. So I wanted to gather some top insights from you all. Who has some thoughts about how that session went? I'm gonna bring the mic over so folks online can hear you.
I guess I was like wondering for specifically for like the second script, like it seems a bit strange, like asking the user to like put themselves in the shoes of like it was like a researching software solutions, like all that, like what if they don't even know about that? Like how can they pretend to know what they want, you know?
Yeah. That is a great point. And actually, we were talking about pre-screeners. Actually, did you want to?
Yeah, so we were talking about script one with Airbnb. And I had told I was the user, the mock user, and I told my team, I was like, I'm an expert user at Airbnb. Like I go on this site pretty often. And we were talking about, in some ways, how does that bias and how is that great? Because you're getting all these different features. And I told them, you put that in your screener, like proficiency with the tool or how often have you used said tool. And I wouldn't turn away someone just because they're a proficient user. You can get great things from a novice. You can get great things from someone that's an expert. So I would use both of them for kind of different needs.
Yeah, and obviously these are like practice scenarios, but the idea is that, okay, you're now working at a company and you're responsible to buy some software. And so sort of shoving you in those shoes as a novice or as somebody who maybe, I don't know, has anybody here used Jira? Yeah. Okay, so, but yeah, what?
I mean, it's part of the objective as you're writing the script, right? So one of the things you're going to try to figure out is what is your primary objective from this specific user study? And if your specific objective is like to create a walk-up and use interface, then you may be specifically targeting people that don't know about that system or have a certain amount of knowledge about certain things. And so it depends on what your objectives are. If you're actually trying to like study, a purchasing manager for a software company, then you're going to need a much finer grain detail and people with a certain skill set.
Yeah, or if you're in aerospace, you've got a very different audience.
And I was going to add just like embracing agile principles, like being open to feedback, being open to reiterate. Scripts are like hard, right? Like I'd be lying to say like the script I start with is always the script that I end with, right? As you're going through. So something I always try to do is like pilot testing as well. Like I have one or two, even like people on my team, like, hey, anybody has 30 minutes and want to pilot test this, script out with me. So that's a best practice to do as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think I mentioned while I was going through this, the last script that you all just did. I ran that session with my wife last night. So yeah, it's definitely a good thing to do. And it's a great way to practice as well. Like find friends, family, whoever. All right. What other insights did you all get out of this session? Anybody learn anything interesting that you didn't know before?
So you question script too.
Uh,
That was my question.
what do you think was the leading question?
I think it was script two that said, can you point out something you didn't like, or that feature you didn't like on the homepage?
That wasn't, so it's hard and I debated on changing it. But in script 3, I specifically mentioned how are you graded? And in the UI, it uses the word grading, like here's how you're graded. And so I was using interface language in the question. I tried to think through another way to phrase it, but I was like, it'll be a great experience for people to be like, hey, this is a leading question. But there probably are other leading questions in there. I don't know. They're very quick. It's hard to write a 15-minute usability test for an application that you don't work on. So props to Antoine and props to myself, I guess, too. All right, what other insights about user research? I had Christian was talking to me about the importance of note takers. Did you all learn anything about note taking? Yeah. Go to you and then come back.
Basically just how to structure it, because even though you went through it, the different the would likes, whatever it is at the beginning, I'm like wrote that down. But then as the interview was going, I just started frantically taking notes. And then by the time we got around to Leah, she had actually used that method. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that makes it so much easier to actually go back, look at what you wrote, and then, debrief in a structured way.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, I really like the I like, I wish, what if. I'm gonna share it with my team tomorrow. So I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I did not come up with that. Stanford D school for sure. But yeah, it does force you, instead of saying like, I hated this, like, I wish this was what? What do you wish it was instead? You know, I think it's a really good, I use it a lot for design feedback in general, because it helps with crafting and shaping your design feedback, the way that you deliver feedback to other designers. But anyways, Jason.
I was with the online cohort with Annalise, Monica, and Leonardo, and they each switched places throughout the time, like all of you did. And it was really interesting with screen sharing as opposed to like, you know, talking in front of a computer, because we got to see some behaviors that we actually see in usability sessions. So Leonardo didn't see the calculator at the top of the screen, and he hit command space and instantly opened up his calculator to calculate the price of the plan for Jira for his team. And I'm like, that was a huge thing, because we're always looking for times when people are going outside our software to solve a problem in a different tool. So that was really interesting. And then I thought our last session, Annalise went like really in depth in talking about her education background and things, and we ran out of time. And I feel like that was a good thing to run into, because it happens a lot in usability sessions as well, where you really have to like figure out how to move the conversation along to the things you want to talk about, while understanding that you might get valuable nuggets from the conversation if you let the person continue to just talk. And so like balancing those two priorities was really interesting. It came up in our conversations as well.
I was having the same issue as a note taker. I was frantically taking notes, but I didn't really know how detailed they needed to be. I guess I understand using the system. I like what if and I wish, but do I need to take notes on things such as he clicked on this and it didn't work, or I mean like, or it didn't do what he was expecting to do? How detailed do I need to get in my notes? Because I feel like I was getting pretty detailed and missing a lot of other things.
Yeah, so transcribing is a job, in my opinion, for a computer. Like when I take notes in a session, I try to stay focused on what are the big insights. So is the user becoming frustrated with this experience because they're like clicking on a thing and it's not interacting? Or in the last one, last night, my wife, she kept accidentally hovering her mouse over that huge menu on the top and it kept popping open and close and got super frustrated with it. Those are kind of top insights that I would capture in my notes. And those are things that I would then bring back with the team when we're debriefing after the session. Like a quote, line by line, everything that the user said, everything that the user did. I don't think that's as important, but everybody takes notes differently. So it really depends on what's going to enable you to communicate back with your team the top insights that you got out of the session.
Yeah, I mean, it's, as he's talking about it, it also matters very heavily like what you are able to do. If you're not allowed to record the session, then you may need to take different notes, right? And so you do want to highlight anything that went wrong and that kind of stuff. If you are able to transcribe, record the entire session, then you can focus much more at the high level. And it's also one of the things that comes out of that is that I like to make sure at the end of a session to leave enough time to ask the note taker if there's any questions that they have, because as somebody running a session, my mind's very focused on the in the moment stuff. And so I would miss like the high level things that they may be picking up in the takeaway. And so even though they're going to be down and in on that, they may be able to stop, take a breath and ask a question that I would have never thought of at that moment.
That is a really good point. And I'm realizing right now, I don't think I put that at the end of that script, did I? Did anybody do that? Ask your note taker, do you have any questions at the end of the session? Yeah, I do it usually when I facilitate as well, but so a pro tip, ask your note taker. I also wanted to springboard off of the note taker real quick. One of the most important things about having a note taker is the facilitator doesn't take notes. Like you are engaged, as Christian was saying, like you're focused in on the session. You don't have that, let me scribble this down really quick as an in-between. But one of the other really good things that Christian and I were talking about as far as like the value of having somebody else as an observer in the session is we all interpret things differently. And so being able to then debrief at the end of the session, like I've had moments where me and somebody else watched the exact same session and disagreed with someone's intent of what they meant. And, sometimes you have an opportunity to follow up with that person, sometimes you don't. But it's interesting how through each of your personal lenses, you could see something totally different.
Going back to the mod guide changes, the two things that I added were from rules for participants. I always try to ask at the end, may I have consent to record? Being that we did it in person, we don't need that, but like if you're doing it like virtually and you're recording on Zoom, that's an important thing to have. And then in terms of the phrasing, I'm very much like walk me through, describe, kind of questioning. So those were some of the edits that I suggested.
Yeah. For scripts, I'll take that back. For scripts, I think there are these are very pared down, trying to keep the session to 15 minutes, which I was actually surprised some folks finished early. I thought everybody was going to be kind of against the wire on most of them. But yeah, I think if you are going to record, of course, you have to ask for consent. Sometimes, usually it's a good idea to also have some folks sign something if that's your policy at your company, right? Make sure data retention policies and all that kind of stuff are being followed. And then also, at the very end of the session, asking folks if they have any questions for you. I've had usability sessions turn into support desk sessions and go for like an hour with somebody where they're like, I'm so frustrated with this feature, please help me use this thing, which can be also insightful. Another tip in the same vein that you were talking about is directed storytelling. So, especially in those preliminary questions saying, can you tell me a story about the last time? And maybe there was one with the Airbnb script of like, tell me a story about the last time you booked something, right? And as somebody talks through that, that can give you fodder for how you might want to shape and adjust the questions that you ask throughout the session. So it's more specialized to that person. Of course, keeping in mind, you want to make sure you don't bias, you don't accidentally lead, you don't accidentally like get information entirely separate than what you're going after for the session. What other? Yes.
One quick thing, and be ready if they say they don't want to be recorded. I've had, like, you just have to be prepared. I've had somebody literally say, you can record me, but I'm not gonna be as direct, right? Like, and so you have to decide, like, is it better to get their full willingness to say whatever, or, have them be on edge the entire time?
Yeah. Candid is better.
Going off of that note, most of the user testing that I have facilitated before, it's been a one-person show, me and the user. If something would happen like that, they don't give me their consent to record. How would I most efficiently be able to take notes about the process?
I probably just try to, you want to get as much as you can, right? So you're kind of in a situation where you could either decide that it's not, you're going to use it more as a test, right? Run the usability and see what you remember after and try to note, or take certain pauses. And, I'm sorry, can you hold for a second? I'm going to take some additional notes to make sure that they're aware that you're doing that. But the data is going to be a little less detailed. You're going to have to make sure to sit down after and take what you can, but it's probably just going to be weaker in some ways. Try to take as much high level stuff as you can. Right?
Yeah.
And
then take notes after too. I will say, I realize the one type of note that I do take as a facilitator during a session is when I have a follow-up question, because sometimes a follow-up question does come to mind, but you can't interrupt. So I'll jot those down as well.
I guess I have a question about that. Would you guys be allowed to, I'm not a UXer, by the way, sorry. But I'm curious, so, I want to know if you guys would be able to use like a speech to text app during the session, so that if you can't record the person, maybe can you have the app open and the app transcribes for you live? They'd have to consent to that too, okay. That was my question. But I also wanted to piggyback on something we were saying earlier and something she was saying earlier. I'm sorry, what's her name? Alea, you were talking about like verbiage that you use during the session. I learned a couple of them today because I was not asking questions when I was a facilitator. I was like, and then just listening to the person. But actually, I learned them from Avi. He said sometimes when it's not moving along, you can say something like, let's switch gears, and then you like take the direction to a different place. And he also mentioned, I saw earlier that you did la la la, and then you like kind of like you're guiding them, but you're really not leading. And I just thought that was really cool.
It's interesting. So in remote sessions, a lot of times you don't have cameras on, so you don't see people. When you're in person, you can get a lot of cues. But there have been for those kind of follow-up questions, actually doing usability testing with Abhi, we've had sessions where like a user would be like, and we just like wait a second for. So I noticed you let out a What are you thinking? Like what's going through your mind right now? Or like something like, oh, like follow up on those cues. Like, hey, so I noticed you sort of had a reaction to this, right? Like what was going through your mind when you had that reaction? Let's for folks online, do any of y'all want to come off mute and maybe share any thoughts or insights that you had during the session? Want to make sure I don't forget about you all on the.
I can
Yeah.
share one observation that I had, as Jason mentioned it earlier, that like in one of our sessions, we went like we were going over, and I was facilitating during that time. And so I think like obviously if I had set up the test, I would know what questions were in it. And in that scenario, to kind of course correct, I would have changed our open-ended questions to more closed questions. And so I think that's another way that you can kind of very gently course correct if you think you're going over, or if things are going in a direction that you want to change, is you can kind of change the pace or change the type of question that you're asking to move things along.
Yeah, that's a great insight. And obviously all of you didn't write these usability test scripts and also aren't necessarily familiar with the applications or websites we were testing. So having that more intimate knowledge can be helpful. I think it also can be helpful to go into it as a facilitator on something that you didn't design and don't know all that much about, because then you're less emotionally connected to it. Like none of you felt emotionally upset when somebody was struggling during your sessions today, right? So that is something that, when you're working in a group where, you can do research for your peers, I think that's always a helpful opportunity as well. All right, yes.
After you're done doing your usability testing, could you go back to a certain spot where the user had issues and ask what they were thinking in that moment? Just going back to help figure out where their head was at if you needed more information.
Yeah, definitely. And so that's why I recommend, as you're doing a session, there may be a follow-up question you have that's going to take you down a side tangent, and you don't want to interrupt the flow of the task to ask it. So jot it down, and then you can always go back to it. Also, what was said earlier about going to your note takers or observers and saying, hey, does anybody have any follow-up questions from anything from the session? Typically, I'll give, and I didn't even, there's so much at the start of this, but typically I'll give the guidance to any observers, like jot down any questions you have, and at the end, I'll open it up for anybody to ask questions. Or if I'm keeping my observers more kind of in the behind the scenes, I'll ask them to DM me so that I can pull those questions at the end of the session to go through them. But yeah, all right, last question.
Would it be worth adding to the script at the very end to ask the person that was doing the usability test if it's okay to contact them down the line in case further questions come up?
Yeah, sure. Definitely. And Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's so many ways to shape this research. Like you can go from an interview into a usability test. You can do a usability test where you have an A and a B prototype where you're comparing and asking them to compare, contrast, and talk about which parts of each prototype they like the most. There's a lot of ways that you can shape this. So it's not like a constrained method, right? Yeah. Did you have a question as well? Did you want, or a thought? Did you want to throw it out there? You can be the last one.
Thank you. I just wanted to share something cool that happened. So before the JIRA paper, we all got that, right? We all got JIRA? Yeah, okay. I was doing pre-planning and like thinking about assumptions and how I could align my assumptions to like business goals. So JIRA wants to be a tracking program, whatever platform. So I'm like, I'll pay attention to how much tracking comes up during the interview. And if it does come up a lot, I can use that to like make me feel more confident about diving into it. And if it's like, I wouldn't dive into it if they didn't mention it. So good planning, I guess.
Yeah, I think something I want to just add, I think you did that, that was great, which is, I think once it was over, just saying like, what assumptions did we make? Maybe more so what assumptions did the user make before they got in and what we made as the facilitator before we got in. And I feel like, I think one of the first things I learned with Matt is like, write down your assumptions. Because it's so important. You think you know them, but actually like forcing yourself to write them down helps a lot, much further down the line. So that was great tip.
Yeah, if you can go into the session knowing what assumptions you're trying to validate, that'll definitely help you validate it more effectively. Oh, yeah.
Annalise asked a great question. What if you have a participant who is not verbalizing what they're thinking and isn't giving you a lot of context clues, is just giving you yes or no answers to things that you want to get to talk more? What kind of tips do you have?
So sometimes you just write off a session, right? Like not everybody is great at thinking out loud, and that's okay. But there are times when you have a user research session and you at the end of it, you're like, well, that was a time and we might not have gotten a lot out of it. But also, you can prompt, you can give guidance. You also, and this actually reminded me on the end of the third page, there's actually Marcelo shared with me, and so I wanted to include it in the packet. But some more inclusive methods for folks that have, different like limited vision. It was something we were talking about before the meetup this morning or earlier today. But yeah, so there's a link there to some additional resources around that as well, because there might be a situation in that regard with someone who's having a hard time kind of verbalizing what they're thinking.
That's a great answer. Something else I was going to add too is I took a training by Dan Berlin. He has a really good book called 99 Things Every UX Designer Should Know, which I recommend. It's a really good book. Anyway, what he says is in his screener, he has one question that's an open-ended question. And I don't know how much I believe this, but he says from the way they answer that question, he could tell their verbosity, I guess, in the session. So he looks at that open-ended question as a guide to see, okay, how verbal or how maybe just like quiet or closed off they might be. So I thought that was like an interesting workaround.
There was some stuff we've done in the past. I don't think we've used it anytime recently, but we used to actually teach the person how to think aloud at the beginning of the session. So we actually had a prompt in the script that would have them think aloud about a non-software related thing, like solving a certain math equation or something like that. You come up with, there's plenty of stuff available for that, but because it's a hard thing to do to think aloud. And so that's why you prompt and you learn how to like trigger it and bring it on. But you want to make sure that they understand that it's not an easy thing and that they're going to have to work at it and that you're open to supporting that. And so one way you can do that is lead in at the beginning with it.
Yeah, that's great. Great perspective and insight. All right, so we did say this was gonna be one of the longer meetups, but I do note it is 9 p.m. We usually end 30 minutes ago, but of course, this is a little bit more of an involved workshop. So we're gonna do a little quick wrap up. And then, if anybody does want to continue conversations, we're gonna do the usual social UX, I believe, right? What is
Pizza place,
the pizza place around the corner?
yeah.
Yeah,